Welcome to 502 Conversations. I'm Brian Kirby, and my guest today is Associate Professor of Psychology, Dr. Rodney Schmaltz. Dr. Schmaltz, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here, and you are an Associate Professor at MacEwan University, is that correct?
That is correct.
All right, and I am going to speak to you today about how to keep resolutions and increase productivity and avoid procrastination, because you have done some interesting research on those topics. Is that correct? A fair statement?
I think so. I think it's interesting. We'll see.
All right. I have a brief bio on you, which I will read, and then we'll get right at it. As I said, Dr. Schmaltz is an associate professor of psychology at MacEwan University, and your research generally focuses on pseudoscientific thinking with an emphasis on strategies to promote and teach scientific skepticism. His expertise is in critical thinking, social psychology, consumer behavior, decision science, decision processes, risk perception, and research ethics. You have several publications and conference papers. You have a recent paper that you have submitted, and it's on unbreakable resolutions and how to keep them, or how to make them, I should say, and then another paper on evidence-based methods for reducing procrastination and increasing productivity. And we'll talk about both of those topics, but the papers have been submitted. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Let's break it down into unbreakable resolutions first, and then we'll talk about productivity. I have read both of the papers. I did find it interesting, but I have a question. Why did you decide to do this research?
I've been interested in this for a long time, and my primary research interest is more on scientific skepticism, so why we believe weird stuff. But that also ties nicely into this area because there's a lot of advice on how to be more productive and reduce stress and so on, and not a lot of it is based in evidence. So I got really interested in that. So when I was in grad school, I was starting to look at some of the classic works in psychology, William James and Wilhelm Wundt. And I was writing my thesis, and I realized that the legends in the field, like Wundt published 54,000 pages, and I was having a hard time getting a half a page a day. So I became curious, what are they doing different? Unless they lived to be 5,000 years old, they were doing something that I wasn't. And I noticed my colleagues in grad school too were all struggling with getting things done. So I started to look for the best available evidence, and there wasn't a lot out there. Now there's a lot of bad suggestions, things like speed reading, which I have to admit, way back when I was a student, I tried, and speed reading doesn't work, but it's popular, and those types of ideas are kind of out there. So as I've moved throughout my career, I've started to collaborate with a behavioral psychologist at MacEwan, Dr. Russ Powell. We've been really looking at ways that you can tangibly measure productivity and improve. So what are the real strategies that have been tested that can help us get better, get things done, and reduce stress?
And when you say there are a lot of books and a lot of suggestions out there, if you go to the bookstore, if people go to the bookstore anymore, and you look under self-help, there are racks and racks of, 27 strategies successful people have and things like that. Now, there's no guarantee if you adopt those strategies, of course, you'll become successful. So it's not really a plan. So when you say evidence-based, what does that mean?
Well, what we want to do is conduct experiments and see if the strategies that we're proposing, or even some of the strategies that are just out there, if they actually make a difference in a more controlled experimental setting. So that's the type of research we're working on. So I just give you a small example of what that would be. So there's this idea that's kind of out there about just getting started. So if you want to change a habit, just get started. So if you want to exercise, rather than saying I'm going to exercise 2 hours a day, plan to do 3 push-ups. And the idea behind that is that if you just get started, but one of the most aversive parts of, say, exercise is just kind of thinking about it and getting into it. But once you start, it's not so bad. So we wanted to see how that holds up. We've been conducting some research looking at this, and we thought we'd start with something very simple, something anyone can do, and that's flossing. So the way we conducted this study is that we had people sign up who wanted to start flossing. So we told them to just get started by at least floss 1 tooth. You don't have to floss all the teeth, but at least do 1. And then we'll measure if that actually has an impact versus people who are told, make sure you floss your teeth every day. So some people are still getting instructions, be sure to floss your teeth, make it a priority, versus this idea of just getting started, at least do 1. And then we can measure to see if there's any difference between those groups. And so in our preliminary results, we've done a little bit of work in this area. It seems to have an effect, but we're still collecting more data. And then once we get some studies showing that this works, and we can see how far it can go. So exactly how do you set it up? And that's the way you do it. So we want to really test. So, we have a group that is doing kind of, we don't want them doing nothing because that's not enough, but we want a control group that is doing at least, making like a to-do list, or at least, being recommended to floss in this case, versus our experimental group, which has that treatment. So the just get started, or the unbreakable resolutions, which we'll talk about in a couple minutes.
Actually, let's go to unbreakable resolutions. Now that you've defined evidence, I will read the title of your paper, Unbreakable Resolutions as an Effective Tactic for Self-Control, Lessons from Gandhi and a 19th Century Prussian Prince. That's quite a title. So before we get too much into unbreakable resolutions, what have you found when you decided to do the research? What did you find about resolutions and how people keep them, how they stop, what happens?
Generally, when we make resolutions, we don't do very good. And there's a couple reasons why. One is that there's this idea that we should be relying on willpower. And that alone doesn't seem to be enough. So if we just say something like, I'm going to make a change, this is going to be different, I'm going to start exercising, or I'm going to diet. Well, that's too broad. It doesn't really help us very much. And then what that can lead to is something that's known, and this is actually the technical term, as the what the hell effect. So let's say you make a New Year's resolution and you're going to start dieting, and then you break the diet and just go, I don't have the willpower, I can't do it, I stop. And that's not obviously an effective strategy. So if you look at things like New Year's resolutions, about 3/4 of people stop after 15 weeks. So it depends on there's a few different papers on this, but on average, we don't do very well. And part of the reason we don't do well, like I said, is that we make these grandiose statements, but we don't really specify exactly what it is we're going to do. So if you say, I'm going to get in shape, well, what does that mean exactly? So I'm going to start going to the gym. Okay, but you need to get a lot more specific in what you're doing. And this some of the research we've been looking at has been looking at things like that. So how do we really help people keep resolutions or change habits that they want to change?
So this is getting into what the title of your paper is, How to Make a Resolution an Unbreakable Resolution. So you're making a distinction there between I'm going to get in shape and actually an unbreakable resolution. So can you define that, or tell me at least what you mean by it?
Sure. So this is what we've been looking at. What Gandhi would do is he would make a vow. And this was different than just saying, I will do this, or I promise you this, but a vow for him was something he absolutely had to do. And this was so powerful that when he was going to go to England, his mother didn't want him to, but he said he'd make a vow that he would behave as she wanted. And that was fine because the vow was so reliable. And that's what got us thinking is, well, he actually seemed to follow through on these things. Is there anyone else that relied on that type of it's almost like a self-promise? And there's not much out there except for Popular Muskow, excuse me. And what Popular Muskow did, he was this 19th century, he was a travel writer. He did all kinds of things, kind of this adventurer. He even performed in duels and things like that. So a very unusual character. He lived to 86, which I think is a long time for somebody that's been dueling, but he did well. But he had what he called this mysterious device. And basically what he would do is say that on my honor, I will do this thing. And he didn't use it very often. But if he decided using this mysterious device, he was going to do something, he had to do it. And Gandhi was the same way. If he made a vow, he had to do it. So what we propose is that we can all use a strategy like that for some things. Now, it won't apply to everything, but we're calling them unbreakable resolutions. So if you decide you have to do something, then it's almost like a promise to yourself, and then you should be more committed to do it. So let me give you an example. The way I use this, and my colleague, Dr. Powell, use it, is that we have a notebook. If we write something down in it, that has to be done. Now, you use this sparingly because it has to be done. So you can't write down, I'm going to exercise for 4 hours today. You probably won't do that. It has to be something tangible that you know you'll get done. So it might be, so for me, I grade a lot of papers, it might be grade 5 papers. I can do that in a day. And if I write that down, it might be 11:30 at night, like I've got a paper to go, I have to get it done. And it's kind of a promise you make to yourself. So it's like a tool that you have now that if you put it in this book, at least in our case, you don't necessarily have to write it down. We find it helps, then it has to be done. Now, one thing Gandhi did as well is he had penance. So if he broke his vows, then he could kind of restore that tool by engaging in penance, which would be things like fasting for him. And we've proposed something similar, that you should have kind of a small punishment set up if you don't make it. This allows you to kind of reset and keep using the tool, because then it's not that you've just failed and you get that what the hell effect. Instead, you said, okay, I didn't make it this time, but tomorrow I'm not having coffee. You don't have coffee that day, then back on track, and that tool is still there for you. So that's what we're testing right now, is to see how generalizable this is and how it works for different types of tasks. The key to it, I think, is kind of how Gandhi approached his vows. So you have to start small. It has to be something tangible. So again, if you're exercising, something like 10 push-ups might be the thing. You can't say something you can't do. And for the vows to be effective, you can allow a small exception. So let's say your goal is to go to the gym for 20 minutes every day. If you get in a car accident on the way, that's fine. That's a reason to excuse it. But other than that, you have to do what the vow is. And when you're thinking about the vow, you have to choose something that you know you are able to do and that you're willing to commit to. So it's not just a to-do list. This is something you are going to do. It's not that you just maybe in the future, it's going to be done today. So the reason we think that this works is that it really changes the way you frame the tasks as well. So you really think, when am I going to do this? How long will this take? Do I have time today? And so there's a lot of other principles bring into this. So it's not just saying that, I promised myself. By doing that, you bring in a lot of other ideas like, specific tasks, tasks you can do, tasks you have time for. And then we think that that's going to be an effective method to get some things done.
And before we go on, because somebody will put this in the comment section, and you've mentioned Gandhi, we kind of have to address the fact that he did make these unbreakable vows, but he had odd ways of testing himself and tempting himself to make sure he could keep them. So just briefly talk about that so that we will address it, if you don't mind. And I'm pretty sure you know what I'm talking about.
Yes. There were some questionable approaches that he took, especially in terms of sexual abstinence. So he would lie naked with members of the opposite sex, but he said that was a test for himself. So we addressed that in the paper, that or from Gandhi's perspective, he was still keeping his vow, whether or not the rest of us would look at that as necessarily keeping it. Well, I suppose that's up for debate, but in his mind, he was still addressing that vow. So we're taking from that, but we certainly recognize that there is some controversy around some of the approaches that he took. But the methodology was what inspired us to then go test it, regardless of maybe some of the unusual ways that Gandhi performed some of his vows.
Now, you said to start small, not make something big that you can't do. So say that you think you're eating too much sugar. Don't say, I'm never going to have sugar again, or I'm never going to have a piece of cake again, or something like that. That would be, I guess, when you're starting, that's a big goal, right? So if you're just going to say, I'm going to have a piece of cake once a week, or something like that, would that be what you're talking about there?
Yeah, with the vows, we like it to be as tangible as possible. So saying I won't have sugar today, that's okay, but it's more about getting things done. We think that's a more effective way to tackle this type of thing. So it might be something like, I'm going to eat healthy and these are the foods I will eat today. So it's got to be really, really specific.
So proactive, something you do, not something you don't do.
That's right. And Moscow used it as both. And Gandhi used it as both. But the strategies that we're looking at, it could work both ways, but it's probably better to say something tangible and then something you have to go do. Now, we can talk a little bit later on about other strategies, to say cut down on sugar, engage in exercise. So this is one really specific tool that we're testing. And I think you bring up a good point. Gandhi and Moscow used it a bit broader than we are, but we're trying to test it and really see if this strategy works for some specific things. And we think too, like I said, it could be a tool that you could use with other strategies that can really help change habits and behavior.
You mentioned that Gandhi would do a penance or something, but as you're working on this, that sounds like a heavy term. So how does one cope with failure? What if you don't get that paper grade? When you say penance, what's a realistic?
It's very heavy in the way Gandhi was using it. So we're talking about things like fasting. We're looking at it more as a small punishment. So the example I used of not having coffee the next morning, things like that. So if the punishment is too much, you just won't do it. And again, the whole thing can start to fall apart a little bit. And we're kind of looking at that. What would be the appropriate punishment for missing it? So with this unbreakable resolution, the idea is that you've made this kind of promise to the self. So if you don't make it, then there has to be some form of punishment. But what that does is it kind of resets everything. It's like, okay, I didn't make it that time, but this is still a valuable tool. I know if I don't make it, I can kind of reset it, small punishment, and then back on track. And some of the studies we've been looking at, it's primarily students, and one student, she would only have a cold shower the next morning. She didn't make it. So things like that. So it's not that it's, as extreme as Gandhi or fasting or something like that, but the next morning you don't get a nice shower. And it can be a really powerful motivator. And she found she did it once, and then after that, the resolutions worked just fine. She did not want that cold shower again.
As long as you go through with the punishment, like you're saying.
Exactly.
You also mentioned the paper, I don't know if you coined this phrase or not, but smaller, sooner rewards versus later, larger rewards. Can you speak about that a little bit? Because to me, it's kind of, I've always termed it myopic discounting, or maybe hyperbolic discounting, where you don't realize that, I decide not to exercise for today, and that today turns into 25 years, and then you're in trouble, right? So is that where you're going with smaller, sooner reward?
Yeah, exactly. Well, when we're looking at smaller, sooner rewards, we were talking about that more in the context of where people can go wrong sometimes. And it's basically what you've described. So if you don't exercise today, that doesn't really have a long-term impact on your health. Just one time you didn't exercise. And the smaller, sooner reward might be that you got to, sit and watch TV and relax. And that would be more rewarding than forcing yourself to go to the gym. But the longer reward that's more, that is far more impactful and important, is that your health will be better. And perhaps you prevent a heart attack, something like that. Now, the problem is that every day we have to make this choice. So some researchers have looked at this, they've called it the primrose path. And what that means is that every day, what's inherently more rewarding might be much worse for us in the long run. So as an example, let's say that you have a donut one day. One donut is not a big deal. It's not really going to impact your health. But if you have a donut every day or two, then you're going to start to get that cumulative effect that's negative. But every day, let's say you're hungry around 3 for that donut, every day you've got to make a choice. Because just because I didn't do it today, it's like, okay, well, I had my donut today, no big deal. But then tomorrow, it's going to happen again. That's the primrose path, because if you're not making any changes to behavior every day, you're faced with the same temptation, which cumulatively can have a really negative impact. So what's often most inherently rewarding immediately in the long run may be quite negative for us. And I can talk about some strategies on how to change that too. So Unbreakable Resolutions is one, and we've got some other ideas too on how to prevent that kind of primrose path, or going down the primrose path.
We'll come back to that. I have a question. I have 2 questions, actually. One is, a lot of what you're talking about seems to be internal motivation, right? So this is something that I'm thinking about doing. And the best example I can think of for external motivation is, I don't know, when my dad was in his 50s, he was a smoker, and the doctor said, if you don't stop smoking, you'll be dead in 5 years. That's an external motivation. And my dad, one of the few people, took it seriously and never smoked again. So the exercise thing also comes at us externally. It's all over the news, exercise, keep healthy, but it's still an internal motivation. Can you speak about any of the internal versus these external motivations?
Right. And that's kind of what the Unbreakable Resolutions get to a bit, because it's meant to be internally motivating, which is quite powerful because you've made this promise to yourself. So, I mean, some strategies suggest talking to others about what you're going to do, and that can work in some cases. But in this case, we're saying, and again, this is one tool of many, but in this case, this can just be personal. So you don't need to tell anyone what you're doing. This is just for you to think about. So you write it down, and then you're going to guarantee to do it. So the external motivators, they can work, but it's much better to have an intrinsic motivator. So if it's something you want to do, you're motivated to, you're more likely to keep doing it. I mean, the way I like to think about it, if you've got a job that you care passionately about, then you're going to keep doing it. Even if the pay is not great, you'll keep doing it. That's an intrinsic motivator. It's an internal motivator. If you got a job you hate, as soon as the pay stops, you're done. So there's a lot going on with this too. Even with the smoking example, people know that smoking is bad for you, and it ties into this idea of cognitive dissonance. So basically, so what your dad did is he changed his behavior. When we have dissonance, that's when we have behavior and a cognition that don't match, or it could be 2 cognitions. So in this case, The behavior is smoking, the cognition is smoking kills me. That should lead to some anxiety and stress. So what you have to do is either change the cognition or change the behavior. Now, changing the behavior in this case is the much better thing to do. But often what smokers will do and why so many people go back, smoking is so highly addictive, they'll change the cognition and they'll say something like, well, so we'll use your father's example. The doctor said that, but doctors have been wrong. Now, it doesn't mean that that cognition is correct, but if you believe it, then you're going to keep smoking. So there's a lot going on here to try to change behavior, which is why it's such an interesting area to study too. It's not like there's one perfect solution, but there's a lot of different areas of psychology, sociology, you name it. There's a lot of perspectives to help us improve our productivity and change our behavior, especially with things like habits like that.
You touched on it. Now let's go through some more of the strategies so you can get some information out there.
All right. Well, we've been looking at this more behavioral approach. So with the Unbreakable Resolutions, that's very much an internal motivator, as you said. But we also were interested in how we can change our environment. Like I said earlier, willpower is not great for us. So if we're just relying on willpower, we'll probably fail. Not everyone, but most people. So what you can do is engineer your environment. And this was an idea proposed by B.F. Skinner, so one of the proponents of behaviorism, so one of the legends of psychology. And what he would do is keep trying to change his environment a little bit to make his behavior more effective. And he experimented with this throughout his life. So even little things, he would get a lot of letters. This is in the days before email. So he set up his office so it was quicker to open the letters and throw them out right away. Now, that might not seem like it's doing much, but imagine you do that with everything. So you keep making everything a bit easier. There's a really good example. I think this is in one of Cal Newport's books, but let's say you want to read more. You get home from work, you're tired, you sit down, the remote's there, you turn on the TV. What if you put the remote in a different room and put a book beside the couch? You sit down, now you've got to make a choice. Do you get up again, get the remote, or just grab the book? By changing your environment, you can change your behavior. And we think one of the keys to that is to do it preemptively. So do that in the morning, put the remote away, because you're not going to do it when you get home, then move the remote. That won't work. So we need to think in advance. One of the best examples I've seen of this, it was actually a student that talked to us about it. She wanted to go to the gym. So what she did is she put all of her work clothes in her car. She had her gym bag by the bed and her gym clothes. So what this means now is when she got up, she had to put on her gym clothes. She had to be ready to go to the gym. And if she decided not to go, she had to walk to her car, get her other clothes, and then come back in and change. So what she's done is she's set it up. So by the time she gets to the car, it's probably pretty easy just to go to the gym. Whereas if she hadn't done that and hadn't had the clothes there and the other clothes in the car, when she wakes up, she's got a choice to make. Do I go back to bed for a little bit? Or do I go to the gym, which is much harder, right? So if we can think about our environment and actually look at tangible changes we can make in our environment, that's another way that we can start to change our behavior. And that's something everyone can do because it's fairly small changes you can make.
And when you put the remote in a different location, don't put it next to the potato chips and beer. So that
exactly.
when you're
That's
reading
right.
your book and you get up to get some potato chips and the beer, you say, oh, here's the remote. I'll grab that.
That's right.
And maybe it wasn't fair of me to use smoking as an example because, as you rightly point out, it is an addictive behavior. But you could also change your environment. So if my dad wasn't a poker player, but let's say that you had a weekly event and most people smoked at it, you might have to stop hanging out with those friends, I suppose, or not that they're bad influences, but it just has an effect on you. Is that
exactly.
another?
Yeah. Or maybe you could set it up so if you're getting together with friends, you go to a place where it's non-smoking, so you can't smoke. So it's a way of controlling that behavior. Because if we're just relying on willpower, especially if we're tired or stressed, like I said, it's not very effective. So you're trying to stop smoking. All of your friends come over, they start smoking. This is an environment where you used to smoke. That's tough. That's hard. But if you meet that same group of friends in an environment where nobody can smoke, now you've got a fighting chance. So those are the types of things we need to think about. And smoking, it is kind of an extreme example, again, because of the addictive behavior, but it still applies. I mean, a lot of the things we're talking about here apply to, improving behavior a little bit and also making some fairly dramatic lifestyle habit changes.
And changing your environment, I guess that also could be taken if you don't want to eat too much sugar or junk food or whatnot. You don't have it in the house. So if you have to, if you need it, you actually have to physically leave and then just buy what you want for that day. Don't get 24 cookies, get 3 cookies, eat them, and don't bring them home. That kind of thing. Changing the environment in your own house as well.
Yeah, and if you look at something like dieting, which people notoriously fail at, that's one aspect is don't have the food there. But I think one thing people miss is you need to find food you like then, because there's healthy food, there'll be some healthy food that you like, find that. So if the healthy food is there and you like that specific type of food, chances are you'll eat it. Whereas if you're forcing yourself to eat a food you don't like, so you don't like celery, but you're going to force yourself to have celery and salad every day, that's not going to last very long. And I think people just don't kind of think that through. I mean, you can go online, there's recipes for almost anything. So find things you like that are relatively healthy, have those in the house, minimize the amount of food you don't want to eat in the house. And by changing your environment, now you've got a much better chance to follow through with that diet.
All right, let's move on, if you don't mind, unless there's anything else you want to sum up there. But let's talk about how to increase productivity and reduce
Sure.
procrastination, which kind of ties in here because you're, making vows to do better in general. But before we go there, I want to talk about how you're doing this research on both of these topics, because it's been a year or 2 years of a lot of medical studies out there, and that's quantitative, where it's easy to say, I give 500 people this pill and 500 people no pill, and I can see what the difference is, hopefully. Um,
Right.
that's a, but you're talking about, trying to ascertain behavior, I guess, in a way. And so 2 questions I have about that. How big a sample are you using? I mean, and what's the age range of it? So what's the sample versus the population? And then how are you collecting the data from these people? Are they self-reporting, I failed, I didn't fail, or?
Sure. Yeah. I'll talk about it in the context of the Unbreakable Resolutions.
Okay.
It's an interesting question because we've been studying procrastination as well. And if there's one group of people that are hard to study, it's procrastinators. Because I overheard one of the participants in our study. He happened to be in one of my classes, and he said, "I'm part of this study, but I just can't get to it." So he didn't even read what he was supposed to do because he's procrastinating. So it's a tough group to study. But with the Unbreakable Resolutions, what we've done, so this is our initial run at this study. We've got 2 groups of 30, and both groups have given instructions to start off, and the instructions are to make a to-do list, and we give them some guidance on how to make a fairly effective to-do list. And the reason we did that is we didn't want to have a control group doing nothing, because theoretically getting any instruction should be better than nothing, right? So what we've given them is a fairly good approach. It's established that a to-do list will help. After 2 weeks, one group then gets the Unbreakable Resolution instructions, and they are told to try that. And then we track their behavior through self-reports. So there's a couple strategies. There's a couple different ways to do this. We've got some online software so they can report daily, but we've done that in the past, and we found that it was too onerous for people. So we're doing it on a weekly report, but there's always problems with self-report data, of course. But we've told people that the purpose of this study is just to see how effective this is. And we want you to be as honest as possible. Some people will do better, some will do worse. So we just really want an honest representation. So it gets quite a bit more detailed than that. We don't want people trying to please the researcher. We want to see really if this is an effective means of that. So far, like I said, the data's trickling in. It seems to be working because we're getting people saying it didn't work for me in a few cases, which is great because if everybody's overwhelmingly positive, because again, we're studying in some studies procrastinators, but for the most part, it seems to be going very, very well. So methodologically, it's actually quite tricky to study procrastination and to study productivity, which is why we think that there's not a lot of more experimental or empirical studies done on it. So it's an interesting challenge, to be sure.
When you're collecting the data from the procrastinators, if someone procrastinates, and some people probably drop out of the study, do you consider
That's right.
does that go into the data as a failure? Yeah, so you have to
We track, yeah. I mean, we don't know why they dropped out, but we just track that they dropped out. So it's something we track. We can't say why they failed, but well, I guess not failed necessarily. We can't say why they dropped out, but we do track that they dropped out. And we certainly consider that as perhaps it wasn't working.
Now, let's talk about the how to increase productivity. I'm sorry, how to reduce whatever it is, how to increase productivity, reduce procrastination, some unique strategies for that. So I think you titled it for faculties and students, but are you getting enough data so you can apply it to a general population?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we're going to start with students, and then we're going to do some studies outside of an academic population. But the basic tenets, we believe, apply to anyone. So with some of the work that we've been interested in, there was a researcher by the name of Robert Boyce, and he did some work mostly in the 90s, and he studied academics, so faculty, But faculty are an interesting population because there's a lot of opportunity to procrastinate because the deadlines for most of what we do are fairly far off. So if you're doing research and writing a paper, it's not that it necessarily has to be done next week. It takes time, and procrastination can happen then with these loose boundaries or loose deadlines. And he came up with some tips, and we've been using these and talking to them to students and doing a little bit more research on them as well. And it's interesting. So I'll give a couple of them. So kind of the highlights of what he's found. Oh, go ahead.
Before you get into that, we'll talk about Boyce's rules and how you've adapted them. But as it was for students and faculty, and I asked about the general population and specifically employers. I mean, do you have any information you can tell me on, I guess, what does procrastination and lack of productivity really cost me? What do I, what does it matter that I procrastinate stuff, especially in the employment world?
Right. There is real cost. So there's been some calculations made. It can cost millions of dollars a year for organizations. Now, I'm a little hesitant to give the exact number because it's a little bit subjective in how it's measured and so on. But there's a lot of procrastination going on at work. And the interesting thing about in an environment outside of academia is there's a lot of different reasons why. I mean, there was one study done where people were tracked who were having poor sleeps, and then they were told to watch a video that was important for work. And they had eye trackers, so to see if they're actually watching the video or not. What they found is people who weren't sleeping well, they weren't paying attention. They just kind of zoned out or were doing other things. So it's a really complex area. There's a lot of different elements to help people become productive. But the bottom line, if you're an employer, when people are productive, they also tend to be a lot happier. And we don't want to say that one causes the other, but one way to think about it is everybody's had those days where you're kind of getting things done, but not really, maybe you surf online for a bit. At the end of the day, you feel kind of, right? But when you have those days when you're really productive and you get a lot done, you feel good when you leave. So there's a lot of tangible benefits to both the employer and the employee. I think the other thing too is if we establish those habits at work, it's hard to shut off what we're doing at work when we get home. So if you've been kind of sort of working all day, kind of half doing things. When you get home, it's not like you're going to change like, all right, now it's time to get at it. That 8 hours will have an impact on us later. So from an employer perspective, it will save you a lot of money. You'll have employees that are generally happier. It won't apply to everyone, but generally happier. And depending on the industry too, there's some research showing that people in a positive, effective state or basically in a good mood, they tend to be more creative. They can see more solutions. So there's all kinds of benefits for doing this. And it's an interesting question too, because there's this idea that you just need to be more productive and kind of fight through and so on. That's not really it. What you want to do is work effectively so you can get the most done, but at the same time still reduce stress. And effectively, we're talking about living the good life. So you want, as an employer, you want to feel good when you're at work. You want these things to transfer to home. As an employee, you want those things. As an employer, you want your people to be effective. How do you get them to be most effective? Some of these strategies can help.
All right, let's talk about the strategies now, because everybody has some tendency to procrastinate, I guess. I'm not sure if you set up the study so you were asking just in general, or you were actually looking for people that knew they had a problem. I can imagine that'd be hard to get people, because you might put up a poster looking for procrastinators and they'd go, oh, I'll sign up for that tomorrow. So that would be a problem.
That's what we did. It's tough. That's why some of these
really?
studies take a while. Yeah. So we
man.
wanted people who were procrastinating. The funny part too is that when you put that out, we put out some ads saying we'd like people that are procrastinating and who want to improve. You'll get some people that actually aren't procrastinating. They're doing really, really well, but they want to improve. So they perceive themselves as procrastinating, but not really. So you've got a straight A student that wants to get to an A+, and it's like, well, that's not our target. But I mean, we still involve those people in the studies. So it's interesting, even just, tracking the sample to make sure you get people who are actually procrastinators. And there's scales to determine that. So we have measures to make sure that we are actually getting true procrastinators.
Well, yeah, I guess getting your sample size, trying to keep that bias out of it would be, wow. So there's a whole, before you even get started, there's a whole checklist. Well,
yes. Oh, yes.
So let's talk about the strategies now, because this is the high, people want to know, okay, how can I do this? What can I do? So tell me about Boyce's rules and perhaps how you adapted them.
Yeah. So with Boyce's rules, so Boyce did these studies on academics. He really focused a lot on writing because that's where academics tend to struggle. But his generalizable rules apply to almost anyone, nearly in any industry. So I'll just give you a couple highlights. So basically, he did all this work and he pulled out what he called rules. So rules for people who are productive. he discovered that some people do these rules and they tend to be more effective. So a couple of them. One thing that he really advocates is working in brief daily sessions. So people tend to get bogged down. Let's say you've got a major project coming up and you might say, okay, I'll get to it. And then you binge work and work, 18 hours a day for a couple of days. That's not an effective strategy. You're much better off to do 20 minutes a day every day. Now, that sounds like maybe you can't do, I'm too busy for that, but there's always 20 minutes you can spare at some point. And by doing that, so let's say it's a major project, if you work on it for 15 hours one day, and then 2 weeks later do another 15 hours, you kind of have to go back and remember where you were and figure out what's been done. If you work 20 minutes a day, you know where you're at. So it actually saves you a lot of time and it allows you that flexibility. So it ties into another one of Boyce's ideas that we need to start early. So start before we think we should. And that everybody knows that. So that sounds intuitive, but what most people will say is that I'm not ready yet. But if it's a difficult task, you'll never feel ready. If it's difficult by the very nature, that you're never going to feel like you're ready. So you just have to start. Just start and then schedule those times. So it's those types of ideas. Another one that I really like, he called it waiting. So if you think about how you start your workday, what do you do? Now, what most people will do is they get to work or get to their home office or wherever it might be now, and they'll check their email first thing, check voice messages, just jump into it. Now, what you've done is you've set the tone for the day in that kind of rushed mode. And that'll rub off on other people, and it's just kind of a stressful way to work. What Boyce proposes is that we just take a little bit of time and ease into the day, even just 10 minutes. So as an example, what I do to start my day is I read something relevant to what I'm working on. So a recent paper or a book in the area, 10, 15 minutes. If I don't have much time that day, maybe 8 or 9 minutes. Then I'll do a couple minutes of meditation. And there's all sorts of benefits for meditation, but I'm not a big meditator. So what my meditation is, I take 2 minutes and I decide what's the most important thing I have to do next. A couple deep breaths, then I go do that thing. Then after maybe a half hour or so, then I check email and so on. Now compare that to starting the day, checking email, checking your phone, just rushing into it. You've caught up a little bit in your area. So if you're in industry, you read some things on what's going on in your particular business. Then you've had a chance to relax, decide what the most important thing is, start doing that thing, and then you get into things like email and so on. So it's these types of strategies. They're small. I mean, that's only 10 minutes a day, but can have a real impact on how the rest of your day goes. A couple more too. So kind of expanding on that waiting idea, Boyce had another idea that was called active waiting. And what he found is that people who are effective, when they have those little 10-minute gaps in the day, they do something with them. So they might just start thinking about ideas. They'll jot some things down. So I mentioned earlier, I always have a pen and paper with me. That's what I do now. So if I have 10 minutes that I don't have something that I have to do in that moment, rather than going online or checking email, start thinking about something that's important, jot down some ideas. And what happens then is you're kind of always preparing for the next thing in these few 5-10 minute spots, and you're using that time effectively. So he called that active waiting. So I mean, even taking breaks is great, and we should take breaks. But if you're going to take a break, then go take a break, get away from the screen, get some fresh air. And if you're not taking a break, then use that time. Because what most people do now, especially now, is they'll just get their phones out, right? So rather than kind of scrolling through things like social media or scrolling through the news, which could be quite negative, you're actually actively working towards one of your goals.
Is there a general time frame you would put all that into? Because I understand what you're saying about, have a certain amount of time you work and then have a scheduled break so you can rethink what's happening. But you don't organize your whole 18 hours. You must also be a benefit to unscheduled time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. You want to have a rough schedule so you know roughly what you're doing. I think one thing that's important to schedule is breaks. Some people won't take a break and the quality of work goes down and it's more stressful. And the thing about breaks is most people don't take breaks right. So there's all sorts of benefits to being in nature. And it doesn't have to be much, just walking outside. There's all sorts of research showing that. So again, this is a little bit back to engineering your environment. At the beginning of the day, decide roughly when you're going to take a break and decide what that break is. Because when it's break time, you're tired and you're just going to, I'll just scroll through something. But if you know in advance, then you've got a shot at actually taking a meaningful break, which can help you. And this will sound weird too. It also ties a little bit into scheduling fun. So a lot of people, when they get home, again, very tired, it's been a long day, it's pretty easy to flip on Netflix or whatever the case might be. Or if you've got a family, you're going to be busy. But in advance, choose something you like to do. It doesn't have to be a big thing, but there's research showing, there's a lot of benefits and having something to look forward to. So we can schedule things we want to do. So as you point out, you don't want it to be rigid, like, every day at this time I have to do exactly this, but you want to have a rough sense of what you're doing. And in terms of scheduling fun, you want to have a rough sense of what you're going to do in the evening. One of the things that my colleague and I are interested in, we like to kind of go back and look at this historical perspective. And there's an author from the early 1900s, Bennett, and he really looked at this and he was worried about the Industrial Revolution. He thought people were going to be working all the time. And what he proposed, or what he said, was that think of your day not as work. Because he said what was happening is that people see their 8 hours of work time as the day, and then everything was just a bookend to it. But that's not true. You have another 8 hours, roughly, depending on how much you sleep. So schedule that 8 hours as though it was the work day. So make that other 8 hours just as important as the 8 hours you're at work. And when you start thinking like that, then you can start to do more of the things you're interested in. And I think too, what ties into this is, and this is one of Boyce's rules, we also need to know when to stop. There's all sorts of research showing that there's a lot of benefit to stepping away from work. So if you're checking your email all night, then work's kind of always top of mind. You can't disconnect for a little bit. That disconnect is where sometimes creative ideas can come from, just stepping back a little bit. So one of the suggestions is having a shutdown ritual. And what the idea here is you decide when you're going to stop and then have a small ritual around that. For me, I look at my to-do list and decide when I'm going to do the rest of the things. Now, that's better than just saying I'll do these tomorrow, because if we have a to-do list that's not complete, that can still dominate our attention. So if whatever item wasn't done, I will do this tomorrow at 10. Now that's not on my mind. It's not done, but I know when it will be done. So that's the first thing I do. Then I get the office ready for the next day. So, if there's anything to clean up, so when I go in the morning, it's ready to go. And then that's it. I don't check email. I don't do any more work. That's it. And by doing that, you allow yourself to recharge a little bit. Now, I know in some industries that's tough. There's the expectation to doing that. But I think too, if you start to set those boundaries, people respect and recognize that. And even if you're checking email till say 7 or 8, but at least at some point there has to be a stopping. And that stopping is really important for us.
Can you talk about one of the rules, moderate emotion? How's that working and what is that all about? What does that mean?
Oh, yeah. What Boyce found is that people who would procrastinate and leave things to the end and then engage in binge working, they would get this rush right before the deadline. And if they finish something on time, they would get this near euphoria, he would say. And I think we've all experienced that. So you rush to the deadline, get it, and you get that kind of euphoria. And that's kind of pleasant, but then it's usually followed by a bit of a crash because you're exhausted. And the reality is, if you've been binge working, rushing on one thing, the other things you're working on have probably fallen to the wayside. And then this vicious cycle keeps going. So these highs and lows. If you use some of the rules that Boyce proposed, he believed you can really moderate your emotions. So if you're working every day on something, you're not going to get these dramatic highs. I did it, I rushed to the end, or I studied all night, or whatever it might be. But you just feel better kind of all the time. And that's how the moderating of emotions goes. And he said, too, it's important to step back from work and not become overly involved in the sense that you put too much of yourself into it. So you need to have that perspective so that you can moderate emotion, even just interacting with colleagues. So this kind of building on some of his ideas. But, one thing people are really bad at is accepting criticism. You can prepare for this sort of thing. Now, it's not engineering your environment per se, but you can prepare yourself mentally that you might be criticized. If you are criticized, how are you going to handle this? And imagine through, so kind of work ahead. Okay, let's say this person says this, how I feel. And, we still might get that visceral reaction. Your face might turn a bit red, but then you can step back a bit, moderate those emotions, don't get overly attached, and then you can start to have a conversation with the person. At work, we will have confrontations now and then, but what happens in a confrontation is, so one person is mad, the other person gets mad, both get defensive, nothing happens. One person's mad, the other's willing to accept some criticism, whether or not they agree with it, but they'll listen to it. Then sometimes a conversation can start. And that's beneficial for both parties. Now, this is hard to do. You do have to really think about in advance. You have to be prepared. But I've done this quite a bit. So you get somebody who's slightly confrontational, you take a calmer tone, they calm down too, then you can talk. Doesn't work every time, but it's a much better strategy, and at least it makes you feel better. So you're not in this, confrontational state. So that's basically what Boyce was referring to there.
Can you summarize those? There are 5 rules there you went through, right? So the first was wait.
Yeah, so we've got, there's a couple. So he had wait, he talked about active waiting, using brief daily sessions, moderating emotion. He actually, I believe he has 9 rules. We took the most relevant ones and the ones that we thought would most apply to people kind of on a more day-to-day basis. And stopping was another one of his rules as well.
Now, as we talked briefly at the beginning, there's no shortage of self-help books, right? So how ongoing is this research going to be, even if your paper is accepted for publish? Because this is one of those this is one of those things where I can just see collecting 50 years of data, but I would hesitate to have it all of a sudden show up in like one of these 7 daily habits of successful people kind of thing.
Right. Well, I mean, our plan is to keep expanding the research. So as you say, there's a lot that could be tested. And the books that are out there, kind of the pop culture books, it's not that they're all bad, just a lot of the suggestions haven't been tested. So we don't know how effective they are. So we are going to continue this research for the foreseeable future. And we'll be testing based on what we found. So we're going to expand this research. Like I said, we'll go beyond the student population and start looking at more the general population. Look to see, if there's some strategies that are more effective for some tasks, those types of ideas. So there's a lot of work to be done. But like I said, we shouldn't dismiss everything that's out there, but we should just be a little bit skeptical in that if it hasn't been tested, well, take it with a bit of a grain of salt. It's not to say it doesn't work, but we don't know how effective it can be.
All right, let me ask you a personal side of this, see what you say to this. So an interesting subset to study may be successful musicians. And the reason I say that is because once you become a successful musician, the musicians tend to forget about all the hard work they did to get there. And so everybody thinks, oh, that looks easy, I can do that. But I'll tell you, when I was going through graduate school and as a musician, you want to practice 4 hours a day. You can't just say, I'm going to practice 4 hours today. Someone gave me the great advice where I take 8 things and I spend half an hour on each of them. And actually, I spent 25 minutes and then I take a 5-minute break. That really streamlined it for me, and I was able to get a lot more work done. The problem with that, though, is how do you deal with the fact that you're actually never done? So no matter how good you get at something, it just opens new doors and there's more to learn. Can you comment on that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. Musicians are a great example. We've actually been doing a little bit of work looking at musicians too, more on perspectives of fandom and so on, but we're collecting a lot of data from interviews, and we're going to look at some of that. So one of the goals we had was to try to interview musicians, but it's just so difficult to schedule things, especially now, so that'll be in the future. And musicians are great because they're a lot like authors in that you can always get better, and the deadlines are sort of flexible, a little bit. So it's a good group to look at. A lot of the work that's been done has been on authors because, again, the deadlines might be 6 months, a year off, and then it's much more likely to procrastinate. But I think musicians would be another fantastic group of people to study. So I think the key is, if you've got a lot of these different types of strategies, is to recognize there's not an end point, but if you're just every day I'm going to do this, or I'm going to try to improve here. So if you look at somebody like Stephen King, so regardless if you're a fan or not, he writes a lot. There's no doubt about that. But his day ends fairly early. Likes baseball, likes to go to baseball games, goes for long walks in the afternoon. He's got a good schedule. Depending on what he's doing, he'll be done somewhere kind of noonish, around 2. And he's got that schedule down, works every day, and can relax. I mentioned B.F. Skinner earlier, so he obviously is somebody who wrote a lot as well, and he was always experimenting. He's always trying new things, always trying to figure out exactly what works for him. And by the end of his life, his biographer said he's as happy as he's ever been. And his workday ended quite early as well. So if we get really effective, we can keep improving. And I think going back to the beginning of our conversation, of that internal motivation, the internal motivation to improve, that's critical for work. If you feel like you know it all, then I think it's pretty easy to become stagnant. So I think with these fields that are more creative, it's all about figuring out how to maximize your time, avoid that procrastination, and again, allowing yourself time for that creativity. So giving yourself that time to kind of step back and reflect on it.
Actually, you brought it around to a great point there because, I brought up if you're a musician, you're never done, really. But I guess also if you're trying to eat a healthy diet, you're never done. If you're going to commit to exercise for a lifetime, you're never done. So there's a lot of stuff that you're really never done at.
Exactly. And that's why the what the hell effect is so powerful. Let's say you're trying to diet and then you miss it one day. It's like, oh, I'm done. I can't diet. Well, no, all you know, if you missed it one day, that thing didn't work. So now you know what doesn't work. So try a new thing. And by continuing to experiment and change behavior a little bit, you'll eventually find what is working for you. It's not going to happen in a week. It takes time. It's something we're always working on. But by having these tools, I think it allows us the flexibility to say, okay, that didn't work. Now I'm going to try something else. And here's another thing I can try.
All right, Dr. Schmaltz, Professor Schmaltz from MacEwan University, I thank you so much for being here on 502 Conversations. I am Brian Kirby, the host. Is there anything you want to say that I missed that you want to sum up?
I think we got it all. That was great. It was great to be here.
All right, thanks so much for coming on, and I hope to see you again in person soon. Perhaps seeing you give this presentation, or perhaps the paper will get publication and you'll be giving a talk someplace that I can attend.
All right, that'd be great.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Schmaltz. This has been 502 Conversations. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.